NATO was busted until I came along. I said, everybody's going to pay. They said, well, if we don't pay, are you still going to protect us? I said, absolutely not. They couldn't believe the answer.
On February 10, 2024, while Trump was a presidential candidate in South Carolina, he stated that if NATO countries do not pay as much as we want, we will not protect them. He later mentioned that the United States could leave NATO if necessary. So, how would the departure of the United States, the strongest country in NATO by far, affect NATO? Would NATO retain any deterrence against Russia after the US departure? Is a NATO without the US possible? Could a European army be established? Furthermore, can the United States maintain its military deterrence along without NATO? Or would it form a new alliance? Would the US exit from NATO push the EU cooperate more with China? Frankly, many more questions could be raised on this topic. It is the best to move on the video. If you're ready, let's get started. While running for president, Trump made many populist statements. One of them was that NATO countries were not paying enough in NATO, and that almost the entire burden fell on the United States. To be honest, he wasn't entirely wrong, as the United States was by far the country that allocated the most budget to NATO. Trump wanted member countries to increase their defense spending to 5% of their gross domestic product if he were elected president. He threatened, if NATO member countries do not increase their spending, I will not protect them. So, how did this threat resonate among NATO member countries? Trump specifically targets Spain in this regard. The only reason Trump focused on Spain was not just the low budget Spain allocates for defense, but also Spain's support for Palestine in the Israel-Palestine conflict and its decision to recognize Palestine as a state. Trump did not only target Spain, he also aimed at many European countries. He stated about France, if we hadn't defended you in World War II, you would be speaking German now. Regarding Germany, he said, Germany cannot withstand against Russia for more than a week without the US support. Now, let's take a look at NATO's inventory and see what changes might occur if the US were to withdraw from NATO. Although the figures are not entirely precise, according to open source information, if you look solely at NATO's air power, there are over 23,000 combat aircraft, more than 5,500 combat helicopters, over 7,000 military cargo planes, and more than 5,000 heavy class and manned aerial vehicles. The United States alone accounts for 60% of this list. According to the figures, it seems unlikely that NATO could sustain itself in a scenario without the US. The US is an indispensable country for NATO both economically and militarily. The departure of the US from NATO would significantly undermine NATO's deterrence against Russia. In this situation, could European countries establish a European army? The country that most desires the establishment of a European army is undoubtedly France. French President Emmanuel Macron has stated that NATO is experiencing brain death and has called for the formation of a European army. He also added that Europe should reduce its dependence on American defense industry products and invest more in its own defense industry companies. However, this call received support from some European countries while being opposed by others. In fact, Turkish President Erdogan commented on Macron's statements about NATO's brain death by saying, I believe Mr. Macron's brain has experienced death. The US, on the other hand, strongly opposes the idea of a European army. It wants Europe to be dependent on the United States in terms of defense industry and to act in coordination with the United States in diplomacy. On the other hand, Europe's aging population, low fertility rate, the defense industry not being suitable for the new generation of battlefields, the low rate of people in Europe willing to fight for their countries, and reluctance of European countries to allocate their share of wealth to support defense industry also complicate the establishment of a European army. Of course, the potential departure of the US from NATO poses different challenges not only for European countries, but also for the US itself. Through NATO, the US is not left alone in many wars or interventions in foreign countries, and it can conduct air operations, especially in many Middle Eastern countries, under the name of international coalition forces, without bearing their responsibility alone. NATO allows the US to engage in more effective diplomacy against Russia and China, and when necessary, it can conduct military exercises with NATO member countries near the borders of Russia and China, thereby easily creating the perception that Russia and China are not threatening only to America, but to the entire West. Naturally, The American defense industry takes a large slice of the pie from these situations and sells large quantities of weapons and ammunition to NATO member countries, so they can prevent potential threats perception from Russia and China. The European Union is not a military power, but is a significant economic force. However, with the rise of China, the EU has begun to decline in many respects. The EU cannot compete with China's mass production capabilities in areas such as solar panel production, electric vehicles, textiles, spare parts manufacturing, rare earth elements, and technological devices. The EU's dependence on China is increasing day by day. For many member countries of the European Union, China has now become the largest trading partner. The United States suspects that this economic dependency may eventually lead to military cooperation as well. China has made a significant entry into Europe with brands like Huawei, BYD, and Xiaomi. This poses a threat to both the EU and the US in terms of data security. TikTok is at the forefront of discussion. While the European Union seeks to increase economic cooperation with China due to cheap labor, it also does not want the US to withdraw from NATO and aims to strengthen military cooperation with the United States. The potential move for the United States to withdraw from NATO is seen more as a request for NATO member countries to allocate more resources to defense industry rather than a genuine desire to leave NATO. Of course, it is difficult to predict what will happen while Donald Trump is in the presidency.